Hello to anyone who is following along with this dynamic conversation after the fact. We're glad to know that you are doing that. All right, let us begin with prayer from the New Zealand Prayer Book. Let us pray. Creator God, you created the world and all that is in it, and you planted us as seeds into that world. May we flourish and grow, and in turn sow seeds of love and compassion, justice and truth, hope and faith. Through Jesus Christ, our liberator, who is alive and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Hey, Kim, how are you today?
Sorry, I'm late. I've been to two University of Maryland graduations, one on Sunday night and one on Monday night. So
Wow.
it's been a late nights.
So Annie is a graduate?
She's a graduate. So it's been very exciting. So
yeah. Yay. What's she going to do next year?
She is going to Columbia to get her master's in public health.
You told me that. That's right. That's
so New York City. Here she comes.
That's amazing. Well,
I see you had a graduation as well.
Yes, we did. Will graduated from Elon last Friday. So
oh, that's
we're not
sweet.
Quite sure what's next, but right now he's asleep upstairs. So
well, that's nice to have them home safe. Exactly. And then does he have a girlfriend? Is that a girlfriend in his, a significant other in his? That was cute too.
Yep. Yep, very sweet girlfriend. So he always has a girlfriend.
He has good taste. That's a good thing.
He does consistently. And they're always as nice as they are beautiful. So there you go. All right, dear ones, we are going to push into chapter 13 today. Woohoo! We are not quite halfway done with the Gospel of Matthew. And so, but we're sort of in the heart of the gospel now. And we are today going to hear a familiar parable. Fred gave us a preview of coming attractions last week about the parable of the sower. And since we talked about parables when we read the Gospel of Mark, I thought it would be helpful just to take a second to revisit that. So what is a parable?
A story that teaches a lesson.
Okay.
Metaphor.
Metaphor teaches a lesson. Anything else? Okay. It's like pornography. We know it when we see it. Is that right? So
I've never seen any.
A parable, the Greek word parabole, from which we also get the mathematical term parabola, means thrown together or juxtaposed. So to Ray's point about a metaphor, it's ideas that are cheek by jowl up against each other, images, stories that teach lessons, as Kim said. And so when we're reading the parables, it's always good to think about, what is Jesus throwing together? What ideas is he putting together here? And just a couple of comments about parables. And again, we talked about this before. N.T. Wright, the theologian, former Bishop of Durham and the Church of England, commentator whose work I reference a lot, calls parables dreams in search of meanings. And I wonder what that phrase might mean to you all. I know how does that mean anything to you all? Donna, were you going to say something?
Well, just kind of like Jung's work and the common images and dreams that various cultures share. That's what I think of as a dream, as being some sort of the source of some sort of primitive, not 100% fully, people aren't 100% fully aware of it until it comes into their unconscious.
I love that. That's a really helpful way to frame that. Love it. Thank you.
I'm thinking of like, and I can't even remember the parables, but there was like a lion and then he needed the mouse. And so when we're talking about the juxtaposition of a lion and a mouse, and then the reality of it happening is not true, but they've given meaning. I don't know, it just helps them define something.
I think, yeah, okay. So you're thinking in terms of fables, right?
Maybe I'm thinking in terms of fables versus parables.
But there's
This is true.
some connection there where the
So,
stories impart a lesson or an idea or a challenge, perhaps.
mhm,
Yeah.
mhm.
Anything else?
I had one thought about the previous chapter at the very end.
Can you hold that just for a second?
Sure.
Okay, because when we start reading chapter 13, we'll go back and if there's anything from 12 we want to pick up. The only other thing I would say, oh, Ray, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say on Donna's point, it is the listener brings experience to it to interpret the parable, and it's different for each listener, but there is a common cultural core maybe, or common experience of some kind of in a group.
Lovely. And when you say that about the common cultural core, we think about the material that Jesus uses for his parables, right? It's always grounded, often literally grounded in the life of his listeners, right? So in agrarian culture, we hear a lot of stories about nature, about
Sheep.
growth, sheep. Yeah. So again, it's particular. Parables that we might write today would be very different. They wouldn't be probably about seeds and sheep. Might be about AI or something, who knows? But the context and the culture are important to the interpretation of a parable. And then the last thing I'll say is quoting Frank Kermode, who's another theologian I've quoted before. He says that parable proclaims truth like a herald, and there's the and, best conjunction ever, simultaneously conceals truth like an oracle, proclaims and conceals at the same time, so that there's some work involved in interpreting a parable. It's not always as straightforward as it might seem. So, okay. Just wanted to set that up for us to remind us about the parables. And as we move forward into 13, Fred, what were you thinking about the end of 12? And I'll get 12 back for us here.
Well, when Jesus, replies, who is my mother and who are my brothers? It occurs to me that this might have been written, not as Jesus is saying something, but as Matthew. We know Christianity was fragmented by this time. We know it from Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And it wouldn't really be reunited until Constantine.
Mm-hmm.
This might have been the gospel writer's attempt to position his group as being the legitimate inheritors of Jesus's mantle.
Interesting. And that would make some sense given what we know about Matthew and his point of view and his agenda. Any thoughts or reactions to that?
Let me look at that again. Whoever does the will of my Father doesn't position anybody in a superior position. It equalizes the field, and anybody coming from left or right or center or perpendicular to the whole thing, as long as they're doing the will of the Father, are his brother and sister. I don't see a political message in that.
His disciples, are his family. That's what he's saying.
And anybody who does the will of the Father is a member of his family.
But that was not the way the early church developed. It
But
was
that isn't
riven with
necessarily what is being
heresies
said here.
and, factions and sects.
There certainly were factions. We know that. We're finding more about that all the time.
Mhm.
And there were more flavors of interpretation of Christianity than we can even count.
Although
And
these
we,
purport to be Jesus's words. So, I mean, I think I tend to agree with Ray that this is Jesus's message is whoever does the will of my Father
well, we
is my
know
family.
people were writing in other people's names at that point. It was not considered
Well, that gets down to a
a
question: is this an authentic saying of Jesus? Then
Right.
It,
It's,
it appears identically in all three of the synoptic
I was
gospels.
just going to ask you. So that would suggest that it's more than just Matthew's particular tom to beat, right? Because it's also in Mark and Luke.
a parable. I
But
mean,
that's interesting. I think it's a worthy question, whether it's, so Fred, you asked the question, did Jesus really say this, or did Matthew put these words in Jesus's mouth? Assuming Jesus did say this, given the multiple attestation in 3 synoptic gospels, we could still ask ourselves, how did Matthew's audience hear those words? Might they have interpreted as, okay, we've got the real truth, and those other folks who aren't listening, they are not Jesus's real family. We can always ask that question. Of course, we don't know, but it's an interesting interpretive question to ask. So thank you for bringing that up. All right, anything else before we push forward? Okay, here we go. Would someone like to read? Let's do 1 through 17 as a chunk. No, sorry. Yes, 1 through 17 is a chunk, and then we'll do the next paragraph. Would someone like to read those first 17 verses for us? I can make it a little bigger.
Sure.
Thanks, Fred.
That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly, because the soil was shallow, but then when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among the thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. The disciples came to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? He replied, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing they do not see, though hearing they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, because they hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it.
Thanks, Fred.
like that.
So it's like a teacher trying to meet their student where they are or something. Maybe he's trying to make it more understandable.
Hmm.
Saying there's just only so much he can do.
think maybe he's saying the disciples were able to understand these very lofty ideas without making a real world comparison or something like that, and that he's trying to bring along anybody who has the possibility of seeing and hearing the message. But that's sad that there's just people out there who's just aren't going to hear it or see it. That it's just
Well, I
like,
think
well,
I sort of hear it as I do it in parables, so people are going to have to think about them, ponder it in their hearts, and ultimately, they will come to me. Many will come to me, and I will heal them. So they're not totally being excluded. That's why he does it in parables, is so that they have to wrestle with it a little.
Mm-hmm. So that they have a little skin in the game. They're working for it a little bit. Which, I think that's good pedagogy, right? Good teachers make students work for it, and therefore it becomes their own. And we know Jesus is a good teacher.
and maybe he is sowing seeds and he knows he's going to scatter the message and it's going to hit certain people differently. You know, and it's going to, some will be successful. Some might start to be successful, but then not have roots, you know.
So is Jesus the sower?
Yeah, he's sowing seeds. That's my theory.
I also, I also have the idea of the chosen people, that he's going back to Isaiah and saying that Isaiah was right. Not everybody's going to get it. They're going to fall by the wayside, and that's the way of, that's it. Some are chosen, some are not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's Presbyterians.
That just
What do you
says
mean?
about contemporary reverberations. I can hardly stand it. Look around us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think Jewish people talk a lot about chosen people. And I don't know. I guess to me, it's sort of sad that there is just sort of this finite amount of people who are going to understand or be able to hear, because he's saying that these people exist. I don't know.
Oh, I'm cheating because I've got the gospel parallels.
Yay.
and Mark ends the passage. He doesn't have all the Isaiah stuff at the bottom, but he does have, that they may indeed hear but not understand. And then he says, lest they should turn again and be forgiven.
Mm-hmm. So
So,
there's
and
always
I
a
think that
possibility.
is, yeah, and that's the summary, or at least that's one way to read the summary from Isaiah, is there are these people that are out there, but if they turn to me, return to Jesus, they can be healed.
That's good.
And forgiven.
They always have a shot at it.
That, to me, that speaks to me better than, they're damned forever.
Me too. I like that.
Yeah,
What-
if you don't
It's just
the first
reflecting the
time,
reality of the situation.
you can
There are
come
people-
back to.
Hang on. Sorry, Chuck. Can you start again?
Yeah, if you don't get it the first time, you can come back to it. And yeah, I kind of like what John was saying there. Yeah.
One thing that strikes me that, I think it's because I'm so influenced by our current cultural context, but it's this us and them language, right? The disciples came, why do you speak to them in parables? And Jesus says, to them it has not been given. So there's this bifurcation between those who give and those who don't. And yet that's not an unbridgeable chasm, an unbridgeable gap. So there's
Could we read that as you already understand this. You don't need the parables. They need to chew on the parables and take it in.
Mm-hmm.
I find it very surprising though, because that he says that you understand it and I can speak directly to you, when it seems that in all the gospels the disciples act so clueless and as though they haven't been given this
There's hope for us.
information at all. So that surprises me. So what did he, and I'd love to know, what did he tell them that he's withholding from the rest of us, and we have to scratch our heads over the parables?
Yeah, if this is the best students, the disciples are the best students he's got. I mean, yeah, I'm like Donna, I'm a little disappointed with him as a teacher.
Boy, oh boy, it's a sad state of affairs.
It's a
Yeah.
tough audience suddenly.
What, Fred?
What?
I said suddenly this is a tough audience for Patty.
No, I don't think it's a tough audience for me at all.
I think he's just reflecting the reality. Some people are not going to get it.
Okay, Patty, let me ask you a question to put it personally. When you think about your messaging to children versus adults versus angry versus, I don't know, people who think more like Jesus, don't you feel like this is what you do? You spread the message and then it takes or not, and you try, I don't know, and you put it into other language?
And you know what? And even more than at St. Dunstan's, I'll go back to St. Andrews, as a classroom teacher of middle and high school students. It would be fascinating how, I'd say the same thing, and months later, you could see the light bulb go off. It's like, okay, that's that seed that was sowed back in September. Fine.
Right.
And so,
Yeah.
and we all process differently, and we all have stuff going on for ourselves that makes it easy or difficult to understand or to believe or to take something in at a particular time. What was I going to say? I was going to say something and I know what it was. When we were talking about if these are the best students and the disciples who so often are clueless, in Mark's gospel, when we read that together, it was so obvious, Jesus would say, have you been with me all this time and you still don't get it? Matthew's a little softer. However, there are all these moments where the disciples are amazed by Jesus, even though they've been with him, right? And they've been in the boat and they see what he's doing, and they're like, "Wow!" So it's gradual. And I think about that definition that Frank Kermode gave. Parables proclaim truth and conceal. It's like some things people aren't going to see until they're ready to see. And we're all on a different trajectory where that's concerned. It's definitely not linear. And that's what I hear in the parable of the sower, because it's not a one-to-one correspondence. Some things will grow, some things will wither, others will take their time.
How many
And
of
it
the
was
eight
safer.
students think that, oh, I've got this, I passed the test, and then only later come to the application stage? Good on theory, lab work, something else.
I like that. Fred, you were going to say something. Sorry.
No, it was safer for Jesus quite often to speak in parables too, because if you're going to proclaim yourself to be, the Son of God and the Messiah, you're going to have both the Jewish hierarchy and the Romans after you in a heartbeat if you say it directly.
So maybe veiling it a little bit is wiser, right?
Oh yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's what kept him alive for as long as he did manage to survive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Were there any words or ideas in those first couple paragraphs that you wanted to look at in the Greek? Or is it pretty straightforward?
What is so? Like, let's say so. being a
see.
seed. I mean, I know what it means, but I'm curious, and
Verse 3. Okay, hang on one second.
because he says the word quite a bit in the paragraph.
Mhm. Sarah went out to, so tired of these people. Okay. Spiro. Sower, receive seed,
Scatter seed.
scatter. And it comes from spao. Spao, meaning to draw one's sword. Interesting. If you actually get to see the text between all these things moving around, it's just, I'm so sick of this mess. Okay. Good question, Kim. Any other words that you're interested in? Or shall we push on? All right. Well, this is one of those rare times that Jesus actually does his own interpretation. He explains the parable. Would someone like to read that explanation? If I can get rid of all this mess.
I'd be happy to read it.
Thanks, John.
Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while, and when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. As for what was sown among the thorns, this is he who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the delight in riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what was sown on good soil, this is he who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30.
Thank you. So it seems as though Jesus wants the disciples to get it. I mean, he gives them the answer key. This is, again, one of those rare times when he says, this is what this means.
Let me just interject, Patty, about what you mentioned before, because in Mark, they say, what do the parables means? He says, do you not understand this parable? Well, how then are you going to understand all the parables? Okay, and then he gives
Exactly. He's giving the parable of the parable.
Meta parable. Exactly.
Let me ask, do people find that this would be a hard thing to understand without the explanation? Do you think most people would kind of get the drift of what he was saying, whether he had explained it or not?
Good question.
Well, if you're a good teacher, sometimes you have to underscore the obvious.
Did you know that when birds travel with seeds in their beaks, they actually replant them other places? They can actually grow these groves of certain kinds of trees, and I don't
Yeah, there are
know.
a lot of seeds that are meant for the fruit to be eaten, and the seed passes through the digestive system. And
Yes. Yes.
I mean, plants have adapted to that.
I think that there are some
I'm glad
people who will
Jesus
get
didn't
it.
add that particular part into the parable.
Yeah.
He does have bathroom humor elsewhere, but this time he
Yeah.
does. What were you going to say?
I do think that some people will hear it in the parable sense, and it will make more sense to them. Because you have to imagine that the intellect is it's a combination of intellects at this time in the world. There's probably not some requirement of, after 13, right? The men probably learn to read as much as up to age 13. The women don't necessarily. And you know, I just think that it's such a mixture that the parable will hit certain people in a certain way. Some will understand it better this way, this
Mm.
sort of figurative, real life way. Whereas other people need that very literal. And now it's striking me that there's no female disciples. So now I'm like off on another thought. I'm like,
Oh, I don't know about that.
well, I mean, Mary Magdalene, would you think she comes along? Yeah.
She
Mhm.
was the one who seemed to get it more than the men.
Definitely. Definitely.
And look at Mary and Martha.
Mm-hmm. Very close friends of Jesus. And, you know, again, I'm jumping into another gospel, but Luke is very clear that women were always following as well. They don't make it into the primary narrative, and they're often not named, but it's very clear that there are women as well. Just interesting how they kind of get written out or pushed out.
Mhm.
It's rather rather like Paul's letters, the ones that were not written by Paul that were written later, you know, clearly show the church trying to adjust to the patriarchal society.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, there may be no male or female in the spirit, but in the but in the gathering, women should, you know, cover their hair and not speak.
Yep, but the rich women are supposed to pay up, right? There's
Oh, I mean, money is a whole different issue there,
yeah, the rich
Patty.
women funded a lot of the early church. So anyway, we digress.
Yes, sorry.
That's why we have that's where we have the most fun.
I know, I know.
It's how my brain works.
I know. I think that's how all of our brains work. So
I would just note, Patty, on your point about multiple attestation.
Mhm.
This is interesting because the parallel of the sower and the explanation appear almost verbatim in all three. So that it, you know, the fact that he gave the parable and then at least, you know, Mark the earliest, then wrote down the explanation, you know, seems to again give an interesting that this is a real explanation of this one that he gave.
Definitely.
Is he giving this explanation to the disciples, or is it out there for everybody?
Good question. Who's hearing this?
The disciples
Yeah.
are hearing this.
Well,
This
the
is-
disciples asked a question. We don't know if it was a public question because Jesus is sitting out in a boat in the middle of the lake.
Out in the boat, talking to the people on the shore.
So it depends on whether the disciples are in the boat with him or whether they're on land.
Well, it started out with then the disciples came and said to him.
Hmm.
And in Mark it says, and when he was alone, those who were about him were the 12 and asked him about the parables.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
And Luke says, and when the disciples asked him, he said to them. So this seems to be after the
After the
speech in the
sermon.
boat.
Mm-hmm. And again, we hear this us them language that it seems as though he's gathering and maybe fortifying the closer in group, those disciples, and saying, you know, you've got this, not this intel, you've got this gnosis, you've got this knowledge that the larger crowd doesn't have. And you know, it sounds like as well, he's challenging them to do something with it, right? Because he's talking about bearing fruit and yielding. And so what is
So
it?
it's their job, you're saying. So he's saying it's your job then to make this 60-fold and 30-fold and
Mhm. Anything else there before we?
So it's kind of a double parable in that sense. If Kim is, they are both the ground and the sowers.
Exactly.
Yeah, love that.
And so, and Jesus does that, you know, when we think about, we had Good Shepherd Sunday a few weeks ago, and Jesus said that he's the shepherd, and he also says that he's the gate for the sheep. And if you start to focus too literally on that, your head can explode, because how does that work, that you're the shepherd and you're the gate? So he holds these images kind of loosely. You know, again, and we talked about this when we read Mark, that, and to Kim's point about it being the parable of the parables, that it really sets up the framework for his ministry, because he's tossing seeds out all over the place. And maybe this image will, you know, maybe the seeds will stick. Maybe you like the idea of the shepherd. Maybe you like the idea of the sheep. Maybe you like, you know, I am the vine and you are the branches. So he's constantly generating these ideas and images, I think, in the hopes that someone will get it.
And that word scatter, just meaning scattering, which is interesting, because I know I told you guys I was in sales before, but the technique that we use in marketing a lot is called salt and pepper. So you take your territory, you salt and pepper your message all over, and then it's not like seeds that grow, but that's how you do it. You get your message out. And to some people it's appealing, and to some people, you know, you keep
Has
marketing.
anybody looked at
Very
this?
helpful. Oh, go ahead, Ray. Sorry.
It's just asking. It's, do you know? Does anybody know of an analysis of the parables, and kind of a meta-analysis that, if, as you're pointing out, he's saying the message, if you like this metaphor, we'll go with that. Like the, you know, if you like vines, if you like sheep, whatever. There is. Can we identify the core message that unifies all of those? The core messages.
Great question. How would you
I don't know. I mean, somebody must have done it.
Well, if you had to think about you collectively, not just you, Ray, because I won't put you on the spot, but if we had to think about, we're asked to think about, what do the parables say to us? You know, what, if we were to distill the message of the parable, what is it?
It's the kingdom of heaven is coming. It is leavening the bread. It is the mustard seed growing and getting bigger. All of these things are the kingdom of heaven.
Beautiful.
Different ways to look at it.
Beautiful. Well, that's a great launching pad to these next couple. We've got a whole bunch of parables. We've got 3, boom, boom, boom. And I would like to suggest that we read those 3 together, you know, as a unit, if I can get rid of some of this other stuff. And then talk about them, because I think that would be the most helpful way to interpret them. So would someone like to read 24 through 33?
I could do that.
Thank you, Chuck.
Another parable he put before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed the weeds among the wheat and went away. So when plants came up and bore again, then the seeds appeared also. And the servants of the householder came to him and said, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then has it weeds? He said to them, an enemy has done this. The servants said to him, then do you want us to go and gather them? But he said, no, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let us both grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them into bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Another parable he put before them said, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all seeds, But when it is grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. He told them then another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened.
Thank you. Okay, so to John's point, these parables are kingdom of heaven parables. What did they say? What picture did they paint of this kingdom?
Some will get to be there and some won't. Because some get the message, you know, the weeds aren't gonna go there into the barn.
I would look at that first one and say, the kingdom of heaven may be there, and while the good stuff is growing, we have to put up with the weeds. The weeds are going to get theirs later.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm?
But you don't burn down the house to get to the weeds.
Well, it's like there's a judgment day, right? You're a weed or you're wheat. You're weed or wheat, and one gets into the barn and one.
But until then, I think Ray is saying you don't go out and try to
Right.
root out everything or burn the
Mhm.
fields to get the wheats early.
Mm-hmm. Means we have to live amongst the weeds.
Judge not, lest you be judged.
Yeah, we
is
have
sa-
to live among the weeds. We may be the weeds, friends.
We might be the weeds.
Ah, I
Be
can
like
turn
little
on
weeds.
AM radio any Sunday morning and find out that I am indeed the weeds.
Although with this one, it strikes me that the disciples generating 30-fold, 60-fold, 100-fold, or whatever, as time goes on, hopefully the wheat will, some aspects of the wheat will reproduce. I don't know if they'll drive out all the weeds or dominate, but they will, keep growing until the time comes for the harvest.
Or to fracture this with a more contemporary metaphor, if you're telling people to, bring the kingdom into being, it says keep your eye on the donut and not on the hole.
I think they're all about spread and increase and the message getting out there and the kingdom coming because more and more people have the message.
Mhm.
And an acknowledgement there, certainly in this third one, or this first one rather, that we live in a time where there are people who are going to be opposed to that message. Or, when Jesus says elsewhere, shake the dust off your feet, just acknowledging the reality of what the world is like. Kim, I think it was you who said some time ago that this good news, this gospel, the message of Jesus, which sounds so great, is not universally received, right? It's provocative and it's not good news to everybody. People are going to resist it. And I think that's, I hear Jesus acknowledging that here.
Do you think he used the word enemy, and what does that mean? Because when I think of enemy in a modern day, it's a really powerful word.
Well,
When it
let's
says an
look.
enemy has done this.
And this isn't the first time he's said that. Let's look.
And then it also reminds me of evil breeds evil, like an evil, one person planted a weed and then the weeds can hateful. Opposing God in the mind.
And we often refer to God's enemy. Satan, ha-Satan in Hebrew, the accuser, that force that is opposed to the force of love and good and growth and generativity and abundance, all those really positive words. All right, shall we push on? How about 34 to 43? Well, I can read it. Jesus told the crowds all these things in parables. Without a parable, he told them nothing. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth to speak in parables. I will proclaim what has been hidden since the foundation. Then he left the crowds and went into the house. And his disciples approached him, saying, "Explain to us the parables of the weeds of the field." He answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen." What do you think?
Pretty clear.
Yeah.
It's
And I
very
think it was clear.
apocalyptic.
Yeah.
What
I
was
think
that,
it was clear figuratively.
Fred? What were you saying?
Very apocalyptic.
Yeah, talk about that more. Yeah, say more
Well,
about that.
this is, almost the same as John the Baptist. The end of the age is coming. You want to get on the right side before you're, before you're thrown into the unquenchable fire.
So when we talked about Mark's gospel, we talked a lot about apocalypse and apocalyptic literature. Do you remember does anybody remember what we said about it? What does apocalypse mean?
And you are who?
Like the end of time or the end of.
Well, that's how we tend to hear it, but literally, what does apocalypse mean? Does anyone remember?
I mean, with a revealing or revelation.
Exactly. It's the revealing of, we might say, God's truth with a capital T. And it's this idea that right now the truth is hidden, there's struggle, there's oppression, there's difficulty. And in the fullness of God's time, that will be turned upside down. And the last will be first and the first will be last, that kind of reversal. And so apocalyptic literature was often written by oppressed peoples. Apocalypse is actually one of the most hopeful kinds of literature, because, and you think about what we know from slave narratives, and the same in civil rights, the texts of the civil rights era, is that the day is coming, the day is surely coming, the train is coming, things are going to turn around. And so we hear this here, that there's going to be an inversion. So when we hear the word apocalypse, we tend to think about, like a Ben Affleck movie and everything blowing up, but but in this, apocalypse really was understood as this eruption or a revelation, unearthing of God's truth that has been hidden for a while.
But it
Takes
sounds
me
like
back
some
to
people. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, it takes me back to Job,
Mm-hmm.
where God was perceived as making sure everything balanced out.
Mm-hmm.
And, you could get yours now, you could have yours later. But, if you were a bad person, even if you couldn't see it, justice was coming.
And justice is a hard word for some folks, but it really means being aligned, being in right relationship. If you think about justified margins, right? They're lined up. So when we talk about justice is coming, it's not about you're going to get yours necessarily. It's that God's vision will be fulfilled. That's what justice is. That people, will be
Justice is
lined up.
really more of a concept than something that can, because justice often depends on where your perspective is.
Well, we could have this could take us off into a whole different conversation, but it's worth asking ourselves, is there such a thing as objective justice, or is it always contextual, always subjective?
Go talk to people in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I get back to your point, Patty, about justice being justified. To me, that includes forgiveness, or people being forgiven for things they may have done, or whatever, if they are, truly repentant.
Yes, I agree with you completely. So
When I think about this, just really quick, when how like you think about like this revelation coming to people one by one, like as they die, do they reach the pearly gates of heaven? And then this revelation is understood. But when he talks about pulling all of the wheat at one time, that it makes me think that there's like some big end of time,
Mm-hmm.
Well, is Jesus really, preaching justice, or is he preaching mercy and forgiveness? Because the two can be diametrically opposed.
Well, I
agree.
don't know about that. I think God's justice looks like mercy and forgiveness. It doesn't look like the way humans understand justice. It's Jesus is pretty clear. It's not an eye for an eye, right?
Yeah.
It's not that retributive justice. It's restorative justice. So I think, to what John was talking about before about repentance and forgiveness, Jesus is pretty clear that in the kingdom of heaven, in the kingdom of God, justice is God's will being done, God's vision, which is about healing. It's not about separation, or one-upmanship, or power over. It's quite the opposite. It's not what we think of necessarily when we
No,
talk.
I mean, I go back to the Old Testament prophets who were, very clear that God did not want your sacrifices, he wanted mercy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And,
Hosea. Mm-hmm.
that does not look like justice to us.
But to God it does.
But, there's something very basic in the human condition that says, all this is going to balance out.
Mm-hmm.
But, in spiritual traditions, it's more like, don't worry about it. It may not balance out, but you can balance it out inside yourself.
I think when you at your installation, Randy preached,
Mm-hmm.
and he gave the definition of justice that was something along the lines of justice is love applied to a group, not to individuals, but not just to individuals, but to a group, which goes along with Michael Curry's "If it ain't about love, it ain't about Jesus."
Exactly.
And there's, you know, I mean, I come out of the tradition of Irish justice, which is based on revenge. It's much cleaner.
Much more easily understood, Ray.
Right.
Well,
I would-
Sorry,
but
I
that's
have
stuck.
to
I mean,
go.
Donna,
So,
so great
see
to that you were here. Thank you.
Bye, Donna.
Bye-bye.
Well, I think
Hey,
this is
Donna.
a good place to pause before next week, but I just wanted to say, following up on what on Ray's comment just now, is that, you know, if we think about justice in terms of the ethic of love, the ethic of mercy, the ethic of forgiveness, the ethic of healing, the ethic of abundance, all those words that we attribute to Jesus, that's what the kingdom of heaven looks like, not the kingdom of the empire that's about revenge and retribution and the one with the most toys wins. That's a very different set of values. And so this picture that Jesus paints is radically different from that of the empire. And that's good news for people who are put down by the empire, who are suffering at the hands of the empire. It's really good news. And we can extrapolate from that. And, you know, it's not just a literal empire. Think about the empires under which we suffer. And, you know, that's would be an interesting exercise, you know, to journal about. Like, okay, what wields power in my life? And is that a healthy, generative power, or is it restrictive, oppressive? I think that's all of a piece. All this whole, I mean, this conversation may have felt like it was kind of wide ranging, and I think it's all held together because it's all about describing as the kingdom of heaven. Any last thoughts? So next week we'll pick up at 44, and the treasure hidden in the field, and those parables. And maybe we'll finish next week. It would be great. Yeah, I think we can finish 13 next week. We did a lot today. The fact that we read 35 verses. Hey, let's pat ourselves on the back. That is quite a lot for this crowd. So
Yeah, that's because Jesus has explained it for once.
exactly. Because the answer key, we can move a lot
Yeah.
fast. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
John.
Yeah.
Well, next week we should have Elin back, and hopefully Mark, and Ellie's teeth will be all fixed up, and so she'll be with us. And I hope to see all of you as well. Thank you so much for being here. And I'll see
Thanks,
some
Patty.
of you today.
Thank you, Patty.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you all.
Yeah.
Bye.